Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here this week with U of A economist Andrew Leach, and I figured now that the election's over, the government has to start implementing their promises, and the big one's going to be all the climate stuff. So, Andrew, I figured we would start with the hard cap on oil and gas emissions. This seems to me like it's going to be pretty ambitious and possibly litigious. So, why don't we start there?
Sure. I think I don't know how many court challenges a premier's allowed, but I'm sure there might be another one coming from Alberta. We don't know a lot of details about the implementation plan yet, but as you know well, right, the more the federal government stretches into regulation of provincial industry or individual industries, and in particular regulation of specific resource sectors, the more contentious it gets, and the more we, harken back to Lougheed and think about the 82 amendments and these sorts of things. So I think there's a lot of there are a lot of dragons down the road here if we're not careful. So I expect what you'll see is something like the clean fuel standard process, where we're going to spend some time consulting with industry, develop it, get the industry in some ways to commit to their net zero goals and start formalizing those. And with the federal government, essentially calling the bluff, so to speak, if you think of it that way, that you lay out the pathway, we're going to write it down, and then we're going to agree to this, and then that's going to be what it is. And so, because I think if the federal government has some big partners in industry that are at least on track with the pathway, then the government's going to have a less easy time. The provincial government's going to have a less easy time arguing that the federal government should not legislate the pathway that the industry has already set as a goal.
Okay. And is this something that needs to be legislated, or is this something that can be adopted through the regulations in the existing legislation?
That's a good question. Depends whether they do it through SEPA or if they try to do it through new legislation under a different heading. And my sense is you'll probably see it somewhere on the framework of the coal regulation, the coal power phase out. So in that case, it's regulations under SEPA, but then that still has to go through the Canada Gazette process and the regulatory impact analysis statement, open for comment. So the timelines of that are longer than it might be if we went through a new piece of legislation that was a standalone. But of course, then there's an accepted process and people understand it and know it. So yeah, I'm not in the know as to what the planned route is on this.
Okay. But it's good to know that, there are options for which route this goes.
Yeah.
Something else I've just kind of heard in terms of this particular plan is it kind of calls the bluff of industry. That for so long, industries keep saying, yeah, we'll reduce emissions, but they've got a target 2030, 2040, 2050, and they kind of just keep letting their emissions grow in the meantime, saying that, oh, we'll reduce them in the future, but we're kind of like running out of runway for that. So I just wonder if you can kind of give some more context for that as well.
Yeah, I think that's, sorry, my phone's ringing in the background for you.
Okay, that's fine.
I think that's the right way to frame it, is the industry has put forward a partnership, at least a limited partnership, on these net zero goals. Some of the big players have net zero by 2050 goals. So this is the federal government coming in behind and saying, we're going to hold or reinforce that. So I think there's a couple of ways you can look at it. One is it eliminates a race to the bottom. So if our leading companies are pursuing this and investing capital in it and such, this is the government saying you're not going to be at a competitive disadvantage from doing that. So I think that's a very important bit. The other side to it is it provides some certainty about what we mean for investors looking at this and saying, okay, is that a goal that is real or not real? Now you have some legislation coming in behind it that's essentially going to say, now we're formalizing this. And so from an international investment point of view, it might actually provide more certainty. So it forces the companies to do what they said, but it also tells the international investors that you might be able to bank on this in a way that you wouldn't have been able to before. The other side is, of course, that it makes this real in a really big hurry. And I think that's what we saw on coal, certainly that, all of a sudden it was the energy transition is real and it's happening in a very big hurry. Interestingly, remember the coal regs, like the Alberta coal regulations that were put in by the Notley government in 2015, the pathway that coal is on in Alberta, probably no plant is actually going to be forced out by the regulations. They're all going to have decided to switch to gas or shut down early, mostly because of carbon pricing and air quality regulations. So it's entirely possible with this that, technological developments, global investor pressures, and carbon price combined actually mean that this is not an incremental, really stringent incremental policy. I'll be optimistic to say that, but why not? It's possible. And so I think there are a lot of different elements to it. I use the term calling their bluff or holding them to promise, because I think that's something we haven't seen enough of, right? We've seen industry in Canada be able to say, I always like the policy that isn't on the table. I like carbon pricing until carbon pricing was there. Then, have you considered cap and trade? And then now, maybe we want to think about a long-term net zero goal. Whereas if that were if we'd had legislation in 2015 saying oil sands must be net zero, there would have been great outcry and such. So this is a neat piece of that, is coming in behind the industry promises and saying, okay, we'll put the regulatory backstop in behind that. And you've already said you think it's possible.
Right. Okay. So what are some of the other things that are in the Liberal plan that are going to be either a challenge to implement, or that they can kind of get a start on right away?
So I think the big ones, so the methane emissions reductions is an ongoing challenge. And I think the partnership with the US is going to be crucial, because of course, a lot of times here we're talking about equipment, technology on well sites, pipelines, et cetera. So the more we're aligned with the US on this, the bigger market there is for new technologies. Okay. And so, if you say, okay, Calgary entrepreneur, great, you've got a new product that reduces bleed methane from one particular process in a compressor station or what have you, and you only got the Alberta market. It's a big market, but it's nowhere near if you have the entire North American market to play with. So that you're going to see, and vehicles is the same thing, right? To what degree can we coordinate our standards with the US or with part of the US, like a California, Northeast Canada coalition would be, a big enough market to make some of this work. The other things that I think are interesting, the ban on thermal coal exports is going to be one that I think will shake some things loose. To if you think about it this way, there's a lot of U.S. coal that comes up through Vancouver and exported that way. And so the degree to which we're going to have policy that comes in, just how are we going to do that? Are we actually going to ban imports of coal, or are we going to somehow, I don't know the mechanisms of that. Is it going to be done through tariff or through some kind of quota regime? So it'll be interesting to see what happens on that front. And I think maybe power is the other one, that where a lot of the parties had pretty ambitious plans for decarbonizing our power sector. And I think the question is, how does this trickle down regionally to the Alberta power grid or Saskatchewan power grid or Nova Scotia, where it's much harder to decarbonize just given the physical plant that exists right now as compared to, say, Quebec, Manitoba, or BC.
Right. So you've got provinces who are already largely decarbonized because they've got hydro and or nuclear. And then you've got other provinces that don't have those advantages. I remember having this conversation with the late Senator McCoy once upon a time about how Alberta was basically, they didn't have the rivers to do hydro, and they didn't want to go nuclear, so they were kind of stuck using coal, using the limitations at the time. So how that kind of shaped how their electricity market kind of developed, and what that challenge is going to look like for provinces like that going forward.
Yeah, and I think in Alberta, the coal, part of the reason why the coal phase out and the emissions reductions that went with it were doable in Alberta was natural gas.
Right.
And so you were able to point to, just even thinking from a political, in a political way, right? The worst thing that could happen when a coal plant was being forced to shut down is somebody would have to build a new combined cycle natural gas plant. And so, we know what the cost of power is out of a combined cycle natural gas plant. We know you can get the same reliability protocols. You could do one on the same site. And so the ability for people to say, yeah, I can see how that would work. Like, it might cost some money, it might mean some transitions, but I can conceptualize it. Yeah. But if you say we're going to phase out fossil fuels from Alberta's electricity grid in X number of years, then it's the natural gas plants, some of which have just been built to displace coal. It's also all of the combined heat and power on industrial sites. And that's true in Ontario as well. There's a lot of more combined heat and power from gas than people think of in Ontario. And so these are integrated into production facilities that are not really set up to use grid power fully, or to, there's not a good renewable option there. So How does that policy federally trickle down to those very local decisions?
Yeah, and that sounds like it's going to be quite a series of conversations with premiers and provincial environment ministers.
Yeah, is there Council of Federation this weekend, I think, or early next week?
Well, the premiers all had a meeting virtually yesterday. So,
it was yesterday. Okay, see, I'm behind. It's the COVID thing. I don't know what day it is anymore.
Yeah, they just wanted health money. So so I'm sure there will be yet another meeting coming up shortly, because there seem to be a lot of them these days.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got oil and gas, we've got electricity, we've got methane. Is there anything else that that we should be looking at in terms of what they need to get started on?
Well, as you know, my new interest is constitutional law and thinking about what the federal government can and can't do and how. And the one that I think is starting to bubble up a lot is the plastics pollution. And so it's not climate, it's separate, but there is a court challenge now, a private sector court challenge on the constitutionality of the plastics ban. And I think from an academic interest in how far the federal government can go with criminal law, if you want to think of it that way, in protecting the environment, I think that's our next frontier. Okay. The other one that you're going to see coming is Premier Kenney's other constitutional challenge, which was on the Impact Assessment Act. Right. So to what degree can the federal government take into account things like our climate targets in assessing different projects, and what types of projects can it assess and such? So, that I would expect we're seeing a decision sometime in the next 3 or 4 months out of Alberta, and we're probably going down the same road again, that the Alberta Court of Appeal will find something that will displease either the Alberta government or Ottawa. And then, we're heading back to the Supreme Court probably with that at some point in the next 15 months or so. So,
yeah. All right.
So there's a few, it's a fun time to be an environmental policy person, probably not as fun to be a bureaucrat in Environment and Climate Change Canada, because you're probably running off your feet right now trying to get all this stuff done.
No doubt. All right. So thanks for taking the time to walk us through some of this.
All right. Thank you.
All right. And we'll do it again soon. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks again.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.